Hello everybody, my name is Boulevard, and welcome to one of the last tournament tacticians before we actually get the Rise of the Underworld seasonal underway. Now this one's going to be a little bit lighter, just give you some updates on the meta. There is the Mastering Runeterra $300 single elimination tournament on Sunday for that last minute testing before we actually get into the seasonal next weekend, and next week's of course is going to be a lot more in-depth, but this one, we're just kind of like brush you up on some things, where we stand, how we got here. So when the meta started off, it was heavily centered around Shurima Ionia. What are you doing with your Sivir? Is it Reputation? Is it this Sivir Ionia deck that was relatively new at the time? Or are you going with old classic Overwhelm? As we evolved through that meta, Sivir Akshan Zed has not been performing as well as of late, and it's one of those decks where, because it is a little bit combo oriented, as time goes on, players are going to start to notice a lot more of the inconsistencies in it. Players that were once in love with the deck through absolutely no changes in the actual build are just going to start to hate the deck and get a little bit tired of it, and some players are still seeing it as what it was and what it is, one of the more solid mid-range combo focused finisher decks in the format. Azir Aurelia is probably going to continue to overtake Sivir Zed Akshan. Zed Lulu even is something that players are looking into again, so maybe you put like Sivir Akshan and Zed Lulu and just go for like this really triple elusive lineup. But the main things that have started to come out of the woodwork over the last couple of weeks, initially it was like Nab and Shen Jarvan coming out as these anti-Shurima Ionia lists, and now Anivia has made a really big name for itself last week, coming into this week, as just an all-around good finisher into the meta. The pillars that we're really looking at in terms of what are we beating, what are we countering, what are we playing, are still Shurima Ionia and Nab. These are also sort of the central ban points that players are looking at, though I can't imagine that you're ever really looking to ban Nab unless you are playing a Sivir Zed Akshan or an Azir, probably not even Azir Aurelia wants to ban Nab, but I digress. The point that I want to talk about is you need decks that can effectively pop the spell shields or frostbite the units or anything like that, and that's why Anivia is shining as brightly as it is. It has a win con that doesn't care about Sejuani in Anivia. You're going to clear out the board anyway. You don't really care about whether or not your Anivias have attack points. And the Anivia ability, the Glacial Storm, is really good for clearing out spell shields on things like Sivir or Ruin Runner, and control decks like Anivia, because they have this nice little thing that you'll notice a lot in Challenger decks where, like, I can play my Challenger, and then assuming that I just never attack, you can never play your big threat because I could just challenge it. Anivia functions similarly. You don't want to play Ruin Runner into my Anivia because you don't want to give me the free pop on the spell shield. I just take the pass. Your tempo is completely thrown off. And because Sivir Akshan Zed is a deck that wants to have 6, 7, 8 mana available to them in order to play out all these combo-based spells, you know, get down the Flurry of the Fists, and a Shapestone, and Twin Disciplines for good measure, and then still have Deny on backup. Disrupting their tempo is a massive blow to them, and that's why Anivia has really rose to the prominence that it has, in case you were wondering why specifically this Shadow Isle Failure deck was rising to the occasion. And then, of course, it does similar things against Nab. Nab is a deck that plays a lot of X2s, a lot of 2 HP units, so the Avalanches and the Blighted Ravines and all those kinds of things doing great, and then you don't really have too difficult of a time dealing with the Gangplank and the Sejuani. A lot of the tournament lists have cut Ruination, which I can understand, but I also think that, like, it's good enough into Nab that they are probably going to start putting it back into their lists, especially for the seasonal, because you don't want to go through 9 rounds of your opponents knowing that they don't have to play around that, and, you know, sort of things of that nature. But right now, like, Anivia is really shining through as, like, this great meta tool, and I don't know if we are going to have time to adapt to whatever adapts to Anivia. So this weekend is when things are going to start targeting Anivia, right? Or we're going to really get to put to the test how good is Anivia. Was it a one-time thing? And that's something that you have to keep in mind. It's possible that, like, Anivia was just a one-time thing. Nobody's going to bring it this weekend. We'll see how that goes. But players could start to counter this, and then next week at the actual seasonal is when you'll have to make the adaptation to beat whatever is beating Anivia. But I think that Anivia is a really solid choice into the meta for the reasons that I listed a little bit earlier. It can struggle a little bit with Azir Aurelia. I've been told that this matchup is favored. I have not been able to find the success that others have, but you know, it is what it is. This is definitely a matchup that I would try and jam a couple of times this week, the Anivia into the Azir Aurelia, because that is very likely something that you'll be running into at the seasonal if you decide to bring either one of these decks. You know, you need to know how to play it from the Azir Aurelia side, and you need to know how to play it from the Anivia side, if you're still unsure about your lineup, because these are 2 decks that you realistically could be bringing. Discard aggro, still looking pretty solid into all of these things. Again, doesn't really care about losing its attack from the Nab win con, because, hey, you know, you are not probably, like, you're probably not making it to the level of Sejuani turn and constantly having activators for the Sejuani. While I somehow don't have rockets available, a steady stream of them, you know, things like that. And of course, discard aggro has always been one of the better matchups into the Shurima Ionia in both cases, just because these mid-range combo-y aggro decks, or even just combo-y aggro decks, usually are a little bit weaker to something a little bit more straightforward like the discard aggro. And then discard aggro, of course, has more game against other things than other 12 one-drop decks like Pirates and Spiders, and that's why we constantly see discard at the top of the food chain when it comes to aggressive strategies. Lee Sin also really hasn't gone anywhere, regardless of the high presence of Sivir still, the high presence of Nab, you know, Sejuani being something that can be difficult for Lee Sin to deal with. But all it really took was a couple of Will of Ionias in Lee Sin to make sure that they could, you know, like, get through the Sejuani, or you even just on your Lee Sin turn, you just start off with a Hush onto the Sejuani when you want to set up for your OTK, and there's really not a lot that they can do against you. And that's kind of where Nab is falling into the meta, right? It does very well into the Sivir Aurelias. It does pretty well into the Shen Demacia. It doesn't do as good into discard aggro or Anivia or Lee Sin. It'll probably do fine against Frostbite midrange. Not phenomenal, but it'll do well enough. That's a matchup that's kind of 50-50. And Frostbite, you know, doesn't necessarily deserve to be tier 1. This one's kind of me just, like, putting it out there like, hey, I think that this deck really has the tools to go toe-to-toe with the meta. It doesn't do as well against Anivia as it has other Freljord Shadow Isle decks in the past because of the 1 damage from the Anivia on top of all of these avalanches and blighted ravines does mean that a lot of your units are going to get taken down in a way that they usually wouldn't. But if there's no ruination, then hey, Frostbite midrange gets to go through and have a field day. Now, we did see this matchup in the finals of the Online League Series last week. It didn't go very well for the Frostbite midrange player, but they also didn't draw any of their Trifarian Assessors. They drew all of their Frostbite, and I would not look at that match as a sort of overall picture of how this matchup traditionally plays out. So those are sort of like your tier 1 Titans. That's what the meta is revolving around right now, is primarily Nab and Sivir and to a lesser extent Anivia. And then discard aggro kind of just gets thrown into the works. Shen Demacia usually gets paired alongside Nab, and Lee Sin, of course, still exists as Lee Sin. Something that players have really started to identify recently as a good meta contender is actually Starspring. It does well into Nab because they don't have the tools to deal with a Tahm Kench. Obviously, it's always been one of the better Lee Sin counters. I've been told that it does pretty well into Anivia as well, which makes sense because you are obliterating the Anivias when you eat them with Tahm Kench, and they don't have the tools. Like, obviously they have, like, Vile Feast Vengeance to get through a Bastion, but a lot needs to go right for the Anivia player while still, like, dealing with all of the other 10,000 things that you're doing, and of course there's no landmark removal, so by the time that they actually do deal with the Tahm Kench, because Vile Feast Vengeance is a 9-mana play, you're probably close enough to your Starspring win condition that you're going to push it through. Now, when I tried playing Starspring on ladder, obviously I was struggling with the Zero Aurelia. They were going very quickly, I couldn't deal with that, and honestly, the one thing that I think players are really trying to find right now is, like, what are sort of the flex spots, because Starspring is a deck that hasn't changed a lot since its inception, but I think that one of the reasons Targon isn't seeing a lot of play right now is that Hush is not getting a lot of value. What are you hushing in a discard aggro other than crowd favorite, which are you really hushing that like that? I mean, that's one of the things that Lee Sin will run into, right? Is like, are you hushing a crowd favorite on turn 4 and having an Eye of the Dragon available to kill that, and then not dying to all of the other things that are currently on the field? You know, Hush is pretty good against Lee Sin. It's okay against Nab if you've got a win con that you need to push through on that Sejuani turn. But for the most part, you're just seeing a lot of, like, well-statted units running the meta. And so Hush is, like, not getting normal value. It's getting I don't die value, right? Like, I can throw it down onto a unit that I popped the spell shield of that got 5 pump spells thrown at it. But in, like, a normal game state, Hush isn't going to swing a combat like it does against something like Shen Demacia, where it's like, oh, well, like, they preemptively riposted, and now I have this cool blowout with my Hush. So Hush's value is a lot more important in that it is stopping games from ending, but that means that you are getting value out of it less often, and it can just sit dead in hand, and then sometimes you might even run into a situation where you're dying and Hush wasn't the thing that was able to save you. For example, like, there's still a spell shield on the Sivir that they put down, or, you know, anything along those lines. But Starspring is definitely something that I think players are looking to incorporate into their lineups this weekend. Obviously, there's no overlap. There really has never been another Soraka or Tahm Kench deck or another Bilgewater Targon deck, so definitely keep your eyes out for Starspring. And there's always going to be one of these in the seasonal top 32. I say it every season. There was one season it wasn't true. Empires of the Ascended. We had no Starspring in Top Cut, but there will always be one. It was Sir Turman last time. He managed to take it to a top 4. I I would not be surprised if there was another Star Spring in the top 4 this season. So get some practice in on that one. The deck is a little bit complicated in how you just navigate it. So yeah, that's kind of the broad picture that we're looking at. I will take you on a more deck-by-deck basis and hopefully have a little bit more information for next week. But this one's just kind of a filler weekend. You know, take some time off. Maybe you play in that single elimination tournament. You know, you lose one round, boom, you're out. It's fine. Take a weird lineup. Take something a little bit crazy. See how far it can take you. See what the strengths and weaknesses of it are. Start scrimming. You know, all that kind of stuff. So that's what you need to be doing as we get closer and closer to this seasonal, because I want to see you succeed. You specifically. I want to see you win this seasonal. I want to write articles about you for the World Championship leading up to it, because I still got a few more of those that I have to fill in before we actually get to the World Championship in just over a month. So, thanks so much for watching. My name is Boulevard, and as always, good luck in your tournaments.